facts can be very cold. They don't they actually often do the opposite of evoking empathy. They just make it seem hopeless, which we can't afford. That is, hopelessness is not an option here. We can't do anything that fosters hopelessness.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Bloem, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. John, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm John Coonrod. I'm the now retired from a long career at the Hunger Project, and I chair two boards, Sarvodia USA and the Movement for Community-Led Development's US Association.
Yeah. And and we know each other for quite a long time, John, and we were just before we started recording, realizing that we have a lot of areas where we're in common and also countries that we have visited. Never at the same time, I think. Well, the US is still a visit for me, although I've been living here now for 14, 15 years. But what I find fascinating, John, is and I was at one of your retirement parties, although it was a Zoom. An amazing career. But what I like is, and I don't know if it was at the same time, but around the same time, but you published a book, How the Road Built Me. I mean, first of all, we need to make sure that people will buy the book. I really think it's worthwhile. Although I confess to you, I haven't read everything as yet, but I read quite a lot. And in the book, you share your story so far by, listing, all or many of the people that have inspired you and mentored you. Can you tell us a bit about, why did you write the book? And I think if we start talking, we will also understand more about where you were born, what did you do, and what are you planning to do when you grow up? So, hey,
Yes,
tell us,
those are good questions.
take us on the
So
road.
I had no long-term intention to write a book.
Mhm.
I've, everyone has a journey in their life, and I know Isaac Dennison once said that, any life worth living is a story. And certainly, I've always going back to my childhood, I've always had this experience of being unusually lucky, and sometimes people talk about sort of having to struggle to find what their destiny is or what they should be doing with their life. I have never had that problem. I've had kind of life tell me what it wanted me to do. And through my teachers, through people I've met, through incidents I've had in my life, it all just seems to be preordained as I'm a recovering Presbyterian. I'm no longer a Presbyterian. I'm an Episcopalian now. So I don't talk about predestination. But in the case of my life, it really seems to have been, that I've stumbled onto such inspiring people. And I've worked, probably the person I've worked most closely with is Dil Majumdar in Bangladesh. And, they have a tradition in Islam that, a man's life isn't complete unless he writes a book. And so Adil's written several books, and he was bugging me to write a book. And I realized that I have so benefited, not just from having mentors, but mentors who who really trained me with their stories. They would tell stories of kind of their own awakenings to human dignity and
Hmm.
to how development, for example, is being done wrong or it being done right. And those stories I then use. So all of my career has really been kind of being a mouthpiece for other people's stories. And many of those people are now, as they say in India, no more. They passed away, many of them before the invention of Wikipedia. So therefore, nobody has a chance to ever hear about them. So I felt an obligation to really write down their stories in a way that I've been using them and repeating them to people
Hmm.
over the last 50 years.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, and some fascinating stories. I would like to go, you talk about this period as well, but I would label it as pre-career, 19 January 31st, 1951. So what happened?
Well, I was born very, very important in my own life. And, I was born in a very smug little American suburb,
Hmm.
an inner suburb of St. Louis, Webster Groves. And it's a wonderful place to be a child.
Hmm.
We were free range kids. I could ride, I was close to industrial parts of St. Louis. I could ride my bicycle at age 8 or 9 into places that I would never tell my mother, like the freight yards in St.
Hmm.
Louis. Um, and I had an enormous amount of freedom, and uh, that that most kids don't have anymore, at least in the United States.
Hmm.
And I think that also was really good for me. It left me with a level of probably an unwarranted level of self-confidence early in my life.
Hmm.
And but it was also a town where I got to be shaped by a lot of really good people. I tell the story in there about my Boy Scoutmaster,
Hmm.
and he was one of those adults, Jim McMillan, who treated every child in a way that they felt like they were a peer, that they were an adult.
Hmm.
And I that really shaped me. I forever, as a child, judged other adults. Were they patronizing me or were they actually engaging with me in a way that I at least felt like, you know, I had some dignity in the matter?
When you were um, describing that as 8, 9-year-old, you were cycling, through your village. I was reminded because when I think about you, I think about you on a bicycle actually, and I'm from the Netherlands. I mean, even I think our former, or still he is the prime minister.
Yes, I met your bicycling prime minister.
Yeah, he cycles to work, but you are one of the few Americans that I know that cycle to work, at least on the East Coast. So yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Um, so yeah, so John, then you grow up, um,
Right.
and yeah, why do you decide to study? To and how did you end up ultimately in this work? Can you talk us through that a bit without giving too much away, about the book?
The book.
So yeah.
It was so when I was 13 years old
Hmm.
and still a Boy Scout, I went to the Boy Scout Jamboree, which is a big gathering of
Hmm.
scouts from all over the country and in many places from other countries as well. And the we went to the New York World's Fair, and I've met so many people whose lives were changed at the New York World's Fair.
Mm.
This is not the 1939 one, but the 1964 one. And one of the things that was I came across was this concept of controlled thermonuclear fusion, which is starting to now be in the news again.
Mm.
But at the time, the General Electric company was really promoting it. And they posed the question, was I aware that the Sahara Desert is more intrinsically fertile than the San Joaquin Valley of California, the most productive agricultural region on Earth? And if we had a source of clean, cheap electricity, then we could desalinate seawater, we could irrigate the Sahara Desert, and you could feed the whole world just from the Sahara Desert. Well, this was a time where the news was filled with stories of famines,
Mm.
particularly Biafra, other famines. And so this idea got landed in me at a very early age that there was no excuse for there being hunger in the world. And two, that gee, I could play a role. I could become a physicist and work on controlled thermonuclear fusion. So that was the career choice I made at age 13, which is a good time to make that choice because, like ballet, if you haven't made the choice by 13, you're not going to make it. Physics is a kind of very regimented career path. So, people say, well, how did you get from being a working physicist to being a staff member at the Hunger Project? And it was really the other way around. I was raised to be concerned about world hunger, and becoming a physicist looked like a good way to address that problem. Uh, it was, ultimately an inaccurate decision, but it really did equip me with a lot of handy skills.
Mm. Like?
Coding. So
Mm.
I before I finished college, I had built uh, I'd helped build the first whole body CAT scanner. I
Mm.
had built the world's fastest computer. Um, and so I came up with a whole bunch of useful skills for the physics profession that,
Mm.
I still have the opportunity to use every day.
Okay. Okay.
When you're in development, you have to have monitoring and evaluation and learning
Yeah.
systems. So
Hmm.
I coded all those for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Um, so you end up, well, we were alluding to, or I was alluding to your retirement party. Um, you're still involved in the movement for community-led development. So I would like to talk about it a little bit later. But first, focus on your work uh, at the Hunger Project. If you look back now, John, yeah, what are you most proud of?
So I am most proud of having worked for an organization that was deeply grounded in human dignity.
Mm.
Human dignity requires the recognition of people's own agency, that people are, there. We always had we have this grid,
Mm.
and it's kind of, what is traditional, conventional, patronizing styles of helping people, treating people as quote beneficiaries, treating women as targeted beneficiaries. I mean, there's all this traditional jargon in the development space that is horrifically disempowering. I mean, it doesn't treat people as human
Mm.
beings. And uh, one of the stories in the book is related to a man named Anasur Raman, who I've had the privilege of meeting, but I read his stuff long before, as we were kind of designing our co-designing our programs with various countries. But he tells a story of the Bangladesh famine, and he was the first. He was a member of the first planning commission of Bangladesh after independence, and he was immediately thrust in the role of coordinating humanitarian assistance in Bangladesh. And humanitarian assistance can be very frustrating, can be sometimes dangerous, but it also leaves people with a real sense of being a hero, of being a rescuer.
Mm.
And he very much felt that. And he went out to the villages during this time, and people just reviled him. He said, "Well, um, but why?" And they said, "Well, we fought for our independence, and you have turned us into beggars." And he said, but, there was a famine. I mean, if somebody in your village fell into this uh, lake, wouldn't you throw them a rope?" And they looked at him like he was a total idiot and said, "Well, no, I mean, that happens here frequently. Um, and we know that what you do in that situation is you jump in the water with the person and you swim with them over to the side, because to do anything else would be to destroy their dignity, and what would they have to live for?"
Mm.
And that was like, whoa, that talk about the power of a story. I've told his story to so many other people.
Mhm.
And it really encapsulates what um, development with dignity really means, is that you aren't ever doing things, quote, for people. You are doing things with people. And this applies to people with disabilities, to even children. That I realized that one of the things that we're really losing in the last 50 years is centering our work in human dignity and really having a deep understanding of what that means. And Professor Anas Rahman's story just so deepened my appreciation. As I mentioned with the Boy Scouts,
Mhm.
Jim McMillan, there are good Boy Scout leaders and bad Boy Scout leaders. I was really lucky to have a good one after he retired. Then I briefly had a really bad one. So it was kind of, but at that level, I really wouldn't be able to have explained it to anyone or
Mm.
shared that journey with anyone when I was 11. But after reading Anas Rahman's writings and meeting him, I was really nailed it. And
Mhm.
that's the whole Gandhian approach. You read Gandhi, and it's all about restoring people's dignity, reawakening people to their own dignity. That's what decolonization is all about, is uh, reawakening people to being a stand and a commitment to their own dignity.
Mm.
And that's what Black Lives Matter was about here in the United States. So there's so many movements have that, and yet, we've um, there's so many indignities in our world, and so many people who are not committed to human dignity and really think authoritarianism and this kind of patriarchal approach to leadership is the right thing to do. And I once had the privilege of having dinner with uh, in a small group setting with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I was saying to him, he was telling me about what's on his to-do list, which the person with the most horrible to-do list on earth is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, day after day, he's got to sit down with total thugs and try to talk them out of their
Mm.
thuggery, right? And I said, why is this happening? And at an increasing level. And he said, well, it's been many years since the Holocaust. People have forgotten
Mm.
what this leads to, what authoritarianism leads to. And it's true, people here in this country, other countries have their own rising authoritarian leaders. And, it, when people are fearful, they seem to think that that's a good idea. And as we know from history, it is really not a good idea. It's a story that never turns out well, ever. And that we have to devote ourselves to reawakening our own abilities to tell the story of human dignity and why it is what makes us human. It is at the very essence of being human.
I'm trying to push you a bit, John. Um, so I understand. So, you said I feel lucky that I've worked for an organization where human dignity, is important. We have learned, where that started, that you got that realization. But then if you look back, and because you mentioned, our sector, in the last 50 years have forgotten that. So what have you done, you, John, in trying to ensure that is reintroduced or stays there, or do you give yourself you know what type of grade do you give yourself?
Yeah, well, when you look at how slow this has been, there is a constant feeling of failure, and I think
Mm,
I somehow have been wired with an excess of optimism.
mhm,
I remember when we really and the Hunger Project went through many cycles of reinvention. We
mm,
would come across something we were doing that had unintended consequences and that we needed to redesign ourselves.
mhm,
So we went through that many times, and I think it depends if you grade on a curve
mhm.
or not.
Yeah.
So you know I uh, I hate grading, and I think it's not a good idea.
Mhm,
I know that have been very lucky to have
mhm,
been in a position to really be part of recreating programs that are built on human dignity. When we started in the Hunger Project after the Bangladesh famine, we and many other groups knew from the beginning that who ends hunger in the world are the hungry people themselves. That's what ends hungry, not the scientists who create useful things. They contribute a lot, but even if you look at the Green Revolution, with
mhm,
which had its pros and cons, but it was the implementation of it was through farmer to farmer sharing. It wasn't that MS Swaminathan and Norman Borlaug personally went up to every farmer.
mhm,
They got the farmers together and co-created the implementation, and then got the funding to enable those farmers to share what they were doing with other farmers, and it halted famine in Asia. It was, uh, and now, Swaminathan, who was one of my favorite mentors because he really modeled um, being a humble and dignified scientist. But he knew that it was ultimately people themselves, and particularly women themselves, who were the problem solvers, were the people who were going to solve these problems. And so many of the people that I admire knew that. And I was so privileged to
mhm,
get to participate in that in so many different countries and so many different contexts with so many great local community leaders. And so that's why I felt obligated to write the book.
mhm. Yeah.
So my, you know, those of us who do Wordle every day, it gives you two scores. How much of your Wordle was skill and how much of it was luck? And I feel that our programs have been very, very successful. And my role in it was that I was really lucky. I was able, like a little bee going from flower to flower, you know, I
Mhm,
was able to distill people's wisdom and share it.
mhm. Yeah. Well, I know, and I've worked with you, and I feel confident in saying that from my point of view, you're the champion, John. So I was pushing you a bit, but I think what I always appreciate is, this podcast is called Walk, Talk, Listen, and I think um, you have, shown that you can all do all three. So and especially what I always appreciate, and that, you described it also in the book, is, the acknowledgement that, ensuring that, women have a place around the table, and that discussion has gone further than that. It's now, we're looking at the whole gender spectrum, and rightly so. But I always appreciated that, and yeah, in ensuring that not only voice and choice, we work on that, but also on agency. Um, so that's great. Can you, um, you know, because last week we met each other, we were on the same panel during the Commission on the Status of Women, 68. Um, so I've seen in over the years, some progress have been made, but also there seems to be, steps back that, you know, we're going back into time, it seems. I mean, we don't even have an agreement, at the moment that we speak. They still have to get together to come, to the final document. Um, so what do you see as what? Yeah, describe what you see as the challenges around, gender development, and the role of women and girls within this.
When when I was in college,
Hmm.
the we had it was at the very early beginnings of having coeducational dormitories. Always before that, there were men's dorms and women's dorms, and even when I started college, there were men's dorms and women's dorms. But the woman who had the room right across the hall from me uh, was Gloria Watkins, who became known as Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks uh, was one of the really great Black feminists in this country. And she was right, even as I knew her, she was starting her book, Feminism is for Everyone. And she 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 recognizes that if you get 50 feminists in a room, you'll get 100 definitions of feminism. But she provided the most clear one, and that is that feminism is the recognition that um, that that the suppression of women, the mistreatment of women, is not an accident, but a feature of built-in systemic injustice that needs to be confronted and transformed. So, and that recognition, um, fortunately, I got schooled early in that, and it was in a very male-dominated world.
Hmm.
There were not, in my physics department, we were 50 in undergraduate school, we were 50-50. Sally Ride was in my cohort of
Hmm.
undergraduate physicists. Um, but that was very unusual. As soon as I got to graduate school, it was 97% to 3% male domination. And then when I was working for the Hunger Project, and we recognized just from direct observation that women were doing all the work in rural communities in particular, and that was kind of a grave injustice built into these ironclad roles. But I think the Beijing conference, and so our own programs in the Hunger Project were very much women centered. They focused on women. Because everybody in our field knew that if you can improve the lives of women, it improves the lives of everyone. If you can improve the education of women, it improves the education of everyone. We didn't, at that point, I think, recognize the depth of evil that patriarchy is. And it was at the Beijing Women's Conference, and Joan Holmes, our boss, was there, and
Hmm.
I prepare her for that, but I wasn't there. And but she got us on the phone actually from Beijing, and the males in the organization. She said, "Okay, get the guys in the room." So she got the guys in the room. Most of our staff are always women, but she got the guys in the room around the conference phone,
Hmm.
and she said, "Look, I don't know in what way, but I do know that Beijing is going to change the organization forever."
Hmm.
And what had impacted her was meeting the women who were the survivors of rape in Bosnia. rape as a weapon of war, that that there were not just unjust aspects to male domination. There was deep rooted evil at the base of it. And, we recognizing that and recognizing that our programs, and this is, 80, where was that? 1995, that our programs, while being women focused, were not gender transformative. They weren't designed to transform the fundamental gender norms in each society that gave rise to this kind of evil. When push came to shove, it got evil. I remember doing work, and so a lot of what I wound up doing for the several years after Beijing was doing kind of feminism 101 for men. Because, as soon as we, even in a kind of an enlightened, humanistic organization like ours, when we started saying, look, our number one priority is going to be women's leadership, that, that shifting power to women in every place we work, as the key actors for transforming these gender norms, that was going to be our top priority, and that there was pushback from men who felt, but what about us? What about us? What about us? And it was then discovering that you really could. One, we learned very quickly, whether you're talking about New York City or rural Burkina Faso, you cannot message men. Messaging, a lot of people work on messaging, behavior change communications. You can't do that with men. You have to create an environment in which men think through for themselves the repercussions of misogyny and recognizing it in their own culture and committing to transform it and thinking through practical ways they can do that. So it was quite a learning journey for the 5 years after Beijing before we kind of had our own programs transformed. Found meeting with lots of experienced feminists, and there have always, at least for the last 150 years, there have been lots of great feminists in every country on earth, in whether they were Christian countries, Muslim countries, Jewish countries, agnostic countries. There have always been women fighting for their rights. And so we would, in region after region, we would bring those together and kind of workshop through what difference could the Hunger Project make in this, and what would be the highest leverage pathways for that fundamental transformation to take place. And it was wonderfully educative. But Joan Holmes, our boss, she said, because the Hunger Project started with these statements in various studies in the 70s that said, well, you could, if you had the political will, you could end hunger in 20 years. And she said, and so that was our initial kind of mantra at the Hunger Project. And she said, if I knew we needed to transform gender relations to end world hunger, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to take this on. It is really tough. And at the root of it, and we're seeing that, there was a story last night on MSNBC about the brutal evil being done by drug cartels to women migrants as they wait for their appointment in Texas with immigration authorities. Just horrible, inhuman, brutal exploitation of women by men. And that, once you recognize how deep this is, it then becomes no surprise that it's hard to transform, but it is our duty. It is our reason for being. And for, when you say that we've made some progress and that
Mm.
we've rolled back, um, it's someone recently, and I wish I could remember who. That's the downside of being old. Can't remember where I saw this, but they said you've got to stop thinking of it as all of humanity going forward and then all of humanity going back.
Mhm.
It's really a tug of war, and that there are forces, serious forces on one side fighting for people's rights and dignity, and there's people on the other side who are pulling the rope the other direction. And, it's probably going to be eternal. It's probably, we will never reach nirvana on this one. We can work for that and maybe it'll happen, but we need to be prepared for a long, long, lifelong struggle for dignity, equality, and justice.
Nevertheless, as a world, we said, we need to reach certain goals before 2030. And
Yes.
I know you are very often talking about it. I mean, the listeners cannot see this, but I can, because we're doing a video call. That on your backside, you're showing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, John. So yeah, I always ask my guest, what do you want my listeners to know about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? So that's one part of the question. The other part is a related question, because I do think one of the reasons why we are not on track, we are only at 15% on average of these goals, is that I think we did not pay proper attention to the ability, skills, and knowledge that you need as an individual and as a community to work on these system changes. And I'm happy that, again, a group in the world has developed the inner development goals, uh, being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. So I would like to know if you had heard about the inner development goals and then what you think about it. So two part in this question.
It's Those are two really good questions. The so one of the mantras that Joan Holmes, um, the Hunger Project's founding boss,
Hmm.
said was that you've got to be willing to wade into the mire of the complexity of these issues and make it simple, finite, and confrontable without shortchanging the challenges. And so, we look at and the United Nations. Many people dislike the United Nations because they see it, it failing in its overall mission of creating peace in the world. But I don't think of it that way. I think of it, in fact, one of the stories in my book is about the nun who taught me to think about it as this forum where um, committed people in civil society drag their leaders kicking and screaming into these kinds of goals. And so the first big developmental package of goals that I'm aware of was the outcome of the World Summit for Children in 1990. It was a package of goals that, if achieved, would have meant the end of hunger in the world. The MDGs were another package of goals, which again um, took another cut into the complexity of hunger and poverty and came up on environmental degradation, which, by the way, are all different expressions of a patriarchal mindset. Oh, it's okay to mistreat the world. It's okay to mistreat women. It's okay to concentrate power. It's all patriarchy. Um, so it came up with a great framework for us to do that thinking in. And the SDGs then in the years 2010 to 2015, the world made tremendous progress.
Hmm.
And particularly in Africa, Africa was the fastest progressive region in the world during the MDG era. And that gave us all a lot of optimism. And but we knew we weren't handling everything. We learned a lot. We we got together in a very participatory way and did the SDGs. Now, from my perspective, one of the things that having these goals doesn't, obviously, it doesn't solve the problem, but it provides a framework of thinking and analysis that can make it simple, clear, and confrontable. And that's really important. And I was struck by the importance of these frameworks when I saw them painted on the wall in Amharic in Ethiopia.
Mm.
You know, the rural villagers loved the goals because a consequence of the sort of old colonial era 19th century, many centuries models of education didn't provoke critical thinking. It provoked uncritical obedience.
Mm.
And the great thing about these frameworks is that it facilitates people to do their own thinking and to not think that it's, you have to do either health or education. You can get the people who love education
Mm.
working on education. And anyway, it became a great model. And we at first used each of these frameworks, and we always pushed for agencies to have holistic frameworks because if you just work on one thing,
Mm.
there's so many foundations and agencies that have chased the silver bullet solution. Oh, if we just did microcredit, that'll solve everything. Well, no, there's no one thing that'll solve everything.
Mm.
You really need to create a holistic system where people are working on kind of everything at once because
Mm.
they build on each other. So seeing them as a framework for thinking and act, for walking, talking, and listening,
Mhm.
rather than as a solution,
Mhm.
that to me has been the real uh, contribution of these frameworks of goals. And it gives you metrics to judge yourself against.
Mm.
And when we say that the world adopted them, well, the leaders of world were dragged kicking and screaming to sign on to them. That doesn't mean that the world adopted them.
Mm. Yeah.
The 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 fighters for hegemony, for patriarchy, in for authoritarianism, they were all still there, and they were just being quiet. And I don't think, and I think what we've learned in the last 5 years is how much of that is out there,
Mm.
and what is driving people into that alternative framework of thinking.
Mm. Okay. Thanks. So what about inner development goals?
Well, I think, when, I keep quoting Joan Holmes. She said, "Look, development is the development of people."
Mhm.
It's the human component of this work is a big one. And, is it how we treat each other with respect, how we work together? And they are, and they're hard things. Collaboration is a very difficult skill to learn.
Mhm.
Um, we've always, I think it was really validating to see somebody codify in a package, just like the MDGs, to take these human qualities
Mhm.
and put them into a package. I think is really, really useful
Mhm.
because they aren't, people call them the soft skills, but they are hard.
Mm.
They're difficult. They require real reflection and real commitment to recognize when we're failing at these things and when we're successful and what are the elements of success.
Mm. Great. John, these conversations always go fast. I do have a couple of questions that I really want to ask. So if you can help me with being very quick, let's say, a tweet per question. Um, so are you ready for a couple of questions?
Sure.
One is a question of the previous guest because I really like to connect people. And the question of the previous guest for you is,
what role do you believe storytelling and personal narratives play in fostering empathy and understanding towards displaced communities and migrants, particularly in today's global context?
Well, I feel like I answered that question in the last one because,
Mhm,
the story that Paulo Ramos told at the border of Texas, and then, we've had our own experiences here in Washington
mhm,
where the governor of Texas generously has been transporting these wonderful migrants to our city. Um, these, um, so one, um, seeing those kinds of stories in the news and having people with their own compassion. I mean, this reporter could barely tell her the story.
mm,
It was an interview. It was so raw and so human.
mm,
But then, the first bunch of Venezuelan migrants who arrived here, one, they're wonderful human beings. You meet them, you love them. But Nady, the mom, arrived with having uh, in Venezuela, the reason she decided to leave was that she was holding her baby in a taxi cab when the gangs decided it was time to assassinate the taxi driver, and she wound up with 5 bullets in her. Now, the baby, unfortunately, was unharmed, but she started her journey with 5 bullets embedded in her body, um, and they were able to treat them when she got to Guatemala, and then treat them some more when she got to Washington D.C. But you meet this wonderful,
mm,
loving, sweet mother with bullets in her baby. Yeah, that is going to foster some compassion in any human being, and particularly when you meet this rambunctious little daughter of hers that would be dead if
mm,
not for her courage. Um, it's uh, I think one of the things that's really important is that we in the development world um, always never uh, portray people as undignified or not the agents of their own future. And you've read poems. I've heard you read poems about how what the courage and the commitment is that no one will get into the boat if drowning at sea is not a preferable outcome to the fate that they have in their own country. So we and then every religion teaches this. So those of us who are engaged with migrants or marginalized communities, we really need to up our game in telling those stories because stories do register with people at a more at a deeper level than facts, frankly.
mm.
Facts can be very cold. They don't they actually often do the opposite of evoking empathy. They just make it seem hopeless, which we can't afford. That is, hopelessness is not an option here. We can't do anything that fosters hopelessness.
Your question for the next guest.
Oh, so if this is a tug of war between um, between misogyny and equality, what do you see as the best pathways forward?
Music is very important to me, so I always have a question about music as well. If I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies who you are, who John is, which piece of music or song would you pick and why?
Okay, so you've been to South Asia, and when
Mhm.
you're in a village in South Asia, you are required to sing a song. It is like it would be the height of incivility if you did not perform a song. And so the song I always perform was taught to me by a 3-year-old. She came home from nursery school and she taught me this song by Shel Silverstein. It's called I'm Being Followed by a Boa. I'm sorry, I'm Being Swallowed by a Boa Constrictor. And I don't like it very much. So that's my song. It's kind of silly, but it does it's everybody loves it.
Mhm.
It evokes it evokes chuckles in every culture.
That's great. Steve Hartman of CBS, I don't know if he's still doing this, but he was examining one simple act of kindness and the potential to create a ripple effect. I have two questions around this. One is, do you believe in the simple act of kindness and in its rippling effect, potential rippling effect? And then second part of the question is, if I ask you to come up with one simple act of kindness that you would do this week, what would you do?
Okay. In the Boy Scouts, we are taught that we must do a good deed daily.
Hmm.
And in my neighborhood, um, there's two that I try to always do. I used to think it was a good thing not to give money to beggars.
Mhm.
Oh, well, you're just reinforcing blah, 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 blah. Very paternalistic notion. I always give money to beggars. So that's a simple act of kindness if you think of it as that. This person, it's none of my business what they want to do with the money. Jesus said, don't say no to beggars, and so I don't say no to beggars. The other is that I return shopping carts. So
Hmm.
in our neighborhood, people carry their shopping carts away from the store,
Mhm.
and they just leave them somewhere. And so pretty much every day, if I'm going to the grocery store, I return a shopping cart that I find on the way there.
Okay.
Now, those are not very powerful acts of kindness, but they do reify in me my commitment to not just walk by.
I'm hesitant because we barely have time, but I still have to ask you about the movement for community-led development because okay, your elevator speech. Why should people know about the movement for community-led development?
Well, so I think community-led development itself makes sense to people. That is, that if human dignity is based on people having agency, then
Mhm.
you need to organize society in a way that pushes decision-making to the local level as much as is practical. The school hours in a village, those out, what time of day to start school, that should be a local decision, not a state decision. Building highways across the country, that's a national decision. So community-led development, I think, makes sense to people. Uh, but they probably are unaware of the enormous obstacles to that, given the prevailing patriarchal top-down approach that most people have followed. So having a movement of collective voice and collective action to push for the kinds of policy changes, budgetary changes. Our hashtag is shift the power, and by that mean shift the decision making, shift the resources. And we take it for granted here. We've got 40% of public resources in local hands in the United States. That's true of almost all rich countries. In Bangladesh, I think it's like 3% of public resources are in local hands. So it's really important in our field to recognize the kinds of policy changes and budgetary changes that are necessary and create the kinds of collective action in each country to cause those changes.
Right. Any question that I did not ask you that I should have asked you?
No.
Okay. I would like to
You're
thank you,
very
John. Yeah, I really thanks for making time to speak with me. It's always a pleasure, and we make sure that your book is mentioned in the podcast notes. And yeah, all the best with everything you do.
great. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.